The medicine that treated the founding fathers killed George Washington. But inside that broken system were remedies that actually worked. Plants learned from indigenous peoples, preparations carried from Europe, and observations made where failure meant death. Number 9 saved more lives from malaria than anything until the 20th century. Number 3 became the foundation of modern pharmacology. These are 25 colonial cures that kept the founding fathers alive. Number 25, bezoar stone. This is where colonial medicine begins, with the thing that did not work. A bezoar is a calcified mass found in the stomach of certain animals, particularly goats and ruminants. Colonial physicians sold bezoar stones for the equivalent of a year's wages, ground them into powder, and administered them for poisoning, fever, and plague. The belief was that the stone possessed magical antidote properties. It did not. Bezoar stones have no pharmacological activity against any known pathogen or toxin. Francis Bacon, writing in 1605, was the first major European thinker to challenge the bezoar's reputation. He tested it on a condemned prisoner. The prisoner died of the poison, and Bacon noted the result. Colonial physicians continued prescribing bezoars for another century. The lesson of the bezoar is not that colonial medicine was entirely superstition. It is that the tools for distinguishing what worked from what did not, controlled observation and clinical trials, were invented precisely because so much of early medicine was bezoar stones all the way down. Number 24, Peruvian bark, the discovery that changed medicine. Cinchona officinalis, the bark of a South American tree called Peruvian bark or Jesuit bark, was the most important pharmacological discovery between ancient times and the 19th century. Introduced to Europe in the 1630s and to the American colonies by the early 1700s, it was the first specific treatment for malaria, a disease that was endemic in the colonial South and killed more settlers than any other single cause. The bark was ground and mixed with wine or water and given in doses that reduced the fever and chills of malaria reliably and repeatably in ways that nothing else in the colonial pharmacopoeia could match. The active compound, quinine, was isolated from cinchona bark in 1820, and it remained the primary malaria treatment well into the 20th century. A bark that South American indigenous peoples had known about for generations before European contact was the compound that made tropical settlements survivable for European colonists. Number 23, Virginia snakeroot for fever and snakebite. Aristolochia serpentaria, Virginia snakeroot, was one of the first American plants to achieve recognition in the European medical establishment. Colonial physicians used it for malaria-like fevers, for snakebite, and as a general stimulant tonic. It appeared in the London Pharmacopoeia by 1650, an extraordinarily rapid acceptance for an American plant in European official medicine. Virginia snakeroot contains aristolochic acid, a compound now known to be nephrotoxic at high doses. It causes kidney damage with prolonged use. At the doses used in colonial practice, the diaphoretic effects were real, promoting sweating and fever reduction. The history of Virginia snakeroot illustrates the central challenge of traditional medicine. A plant can have real pharmacological activity and real toxicity simultaneously, and the traditional dose is often the only thing standing between medicine and poison. Number 22. Solomon's seal root for joints and wounds. Polygonatum biflorum, American Solomon's seal, was the joint medicine of colonial practitioners who learned it from eastern woodland indigenous peoples for whom it was a primary treatment for musculoskeletal injuries. The root was applied as a poultice to bruises, sprains, and swollen joints and taken internally as a tea for the joint pain of arthritis and overwork. The colonial physician John Bartram, who corresponded extensively with European botanists, documented Solomon's seal's consistent clinical effectiveness for these applications. The root contains allantoin, the same wound-healing compound in comfrey and plantain, along with saponins that have confirmed anti-inflammatory activity. A 2013 study in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology documented Solomon seal's traditional applications and confirmed significant anti-inflammatory properties. The Colonial remedy for joint pain contained the same active compound that modern wound-healing products are formulated around. Number 21. American spikenard for respiratory illness. Aurelia racemosa, American spikenard, was the colonial substitute for the Asian spikenard of biblical fame, a plant so valued in the ancient world that it was used to anoint the feet of Christ according to the Gospel of John. The American species, which grows in rich woodland soils across the eastern United States, was used by multiple indigenous peoples for respiratory illness and was incorporated into colonial medicine for the same applications: chronic bronchitis, the persistent cough of respiratory infection, and the pleuritic chest pain that came with inflamed lungs. The root was prepared as a tea or tincture. Modern phytochemical analysis has identified diterpene acids in Aurelia with confirmed anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties consistent with traditional respiratory applications. The colonial physician who prescribed American spikenard for chest complaints was using a plant with real pharmacological activity that has been confirmed by contemporary research. Number 20. Oswego tea for fever and immune support. Monarda didyma bee balm, or Oswego tea, was introduced to colonial medicine through direct contact with the Oswego people of the Iroquois Confederacy, from whom the plant takes its common name. When the Boston Tea Party of 1773 made British tea politically toxic, colonists who wanted a hot beverage with medicinal properties turned to Oswego tea as the patriotic alternative. It was used for fever, for sore throats, and as a general antimicrobial. The thymol content, the same compound in Listerine and oil of oregano, gave it genuine antimicrobial activity. A review in 2011 documented Monarda's significant antimicrobial properties against multiple bacterial and fungal pathogens. The colonial rejection of British tea in favor of Oswego tea was both a political statement and an inadvertent pharmaceutical upgrade, because the American plant had confirmed antimicrobial activity that imported tea did not. Here's what colonial medicine looked like from the inside. A colonial American who fell seriously ill in 1750 would be treated first with purging, forced evacuation of the bowels through jalap root, rhubarb root, or senna. Then, with bleeding, the removal of a pint or more of blood through lancet cuts to the arm. Then, with sweating, wrapped in blankets with hot bricks and given diaphoretic herbs. Then, with blistering Spanish fly or mustard, applied to the skin until blisters formed. The theory being that drawing fluid out through the skin drew disease with it. Most of these interventions weakened the patient. Some killed them. Against this backdrop, the remedies on this list that actually worked were not the mainstream of colonial medicine. They were the plants learned from indigenous peoples, the specific preparations that had survived long enough in European practice to have accumulated evidence behind them, and the observations made by colonial physicians who were beginning, against enormous institutional resistance, to track what actually worked. Number 19. Jalap root as purge. Ipomoea purga, jalap root, was the most powerful botanical purgative in the colonial medical chest and was used with a consistency that would alarm a modern gastroenterologist. The dried root, powdered and mixed with cream of tartar, was given for almost every serious illness on the theory that clearing the bowel removed the source of disease. At small doses, jalap produced reliable catharsis. At larger doses, it caused violent purging that dehydrated and weakened patients already compromised by illness. Colonial physicians knew the dose relationship. The most careful among them used small, controlled amounts and observed outcomes. The active resin in jalap root, convolvulin, is a powerful irritant laxative that works through a mechanism similar to castor oil. For genuine constipation and intestinal obstruction, the effect was therapeutically appropriate. For fever and infection, it was irrelevant at best and harmful at worst. Colonial medicine used it for everything. Number 18. American hellebore for heart and fever. Veratrum virid, American or green hellebore, was the most pharmacologically active cardiac plant in colonial American medicine. Indigenous peoples throughout the eastern woodlands used it for rheumatism and as an arrow poison. Colonial physicians used it for pneumonia, accompanied by rapid heart rate, for the fevers that caused dangerous cardiac acceleration, and for the hypertension that they could observe through the pulse without yet having a name for it. The alkaloids, in veratrum, gervine and cyclopamine, slow the heart rate and lower blood pressure through direct action on cardiac and vascular tissue. American hellebore was used in American medicine for cardiac indications through the early 20th century. Cyclopamine, derived from a related species, became the basis for research into hedgehog signaling pathway inhibitors now used in cancer treatment. Colonial cardiac medicine contained compounds that modern oncology has found applications for. Number 17. Indian physic for purging. Galenia trifoliata, Indian physic or Bowman's root, was the colonial substitute for ipecac when ipecac was unavailable. And in many rural colonial communities, it was preferred because it grew locally across the Appalachian region without requiring importation from South America. It was used as an emetic to induce vomiting for poisoning and as a gentler purgative for intestinal complaints. Cherokee and other eastern indigenous peoples had used it for the same purposes for generations and introduced it to colonial practitioners through the direct contact of settlement. The active glycosides in Galenia, gillenin, and related compounds have confirmed emetic and cathartic properties at appropriate doses. Colonial physicians who used Indian physic as a locally available substitute for imported ipecac were working with a plant that had the correct pharmacological properties for the intended application. Number 16. Balm of Gilead for wounds and skin. The name comes from the Bible, the balm of Gilead mentioned in Jeremiah as a healing preparation from the region of Gilead. In colonial America, the name was transferred to Populus balsamifera, the balsam poplar, whose sticky resinous buds were gathered in early spring and infused into oil or lard to make a topical preparation for wounds, burns, and skin conditions. The resin from balsam poplar buds contains salicin, the same compound in willow bark that became aspirin, along with terpenes with confirmed antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Colonial physicians who applied balm of Gilead preparations to infected wounds and burns were delivering salicylate chemistry and antimicrobial terpenes directly to the tissue. A preparation sold in apothecary shops throughout the colonial period for 1 shilling an ounce contained the same active chemistry as aspirin and broad-spectrum topical antimicrobials. Number 15. Gentian root as a bitter tonic. Gentiana lutea, European gentian, and the American species, Gentiana catusbaea and related native gentians, were the bitter tonics of colonial medicine. Preparations given to restore appetite, improve digestion, and rebuild strength after debilitating illness. The logic of bitter tonics was empirical and correct. Bitter compounds, iridoid glycosides, including gentiopacrin and amaragentin, stimulate gastric acid secretion, bile production, and digestive enzyme activity through the same mechanisms that modern digestive pharmaceuticals target. A patient who had been through weeks of illness and could not eat needed exactly this stimulation to begin recovering. The eclectic medical tradition that inherited and systematized colonial botanical practice considered gentian the most reliable digestive tonic available. Modern phytopharmacology has confirmed gentian's gastric stimulant properties in multiple studies. The colonial apothecary who sold gentian bitters to patients recovering from illness was providing pharmacologically appropriate digestive support. Number 14. Cream of tartar as fever treatment. Potassium bitartrate, the white crystalline powder deposited inside wine barrels during fermentation, was one of the most widely used preparations in colonial American fever treatment. Dissolved in water and given throughout the day of a fever, it produced diuresis and mild catharsis while providing potassium that fever itself depleted. Colonial physicians understood it as a cooling, purifying remedy that reduced the intensity of fever. The reality is more straightforward. Cream of tartar at the doses used is a mild diuretic and laxative. For fevers accompanied by dehydration, the additional fluid intake required to administer it was the therapeutic benefit. For fevers accompanied by the electrolyte depletion that prolonged sweating produced, the potassium replacement was pharmacologically appropriate. The colonial fever treatment was partly wrong in its theory and partly right in its effect. Here is the number that contextualizes everything else on this list. In 1776, the year the Declaration of Independence was signed, the average life expectancy at birth in the American colonies was approximately 36 years. This figure is distorted by catastrophically high infant mortality. A significant percentage of children died before age 5, which dragged the average down dramatically. Adults who survived to age 20 could expect to live into their late 50s or 60s. The Founding Fathers lived remarkably long lives by the standards of their era. Franklin lived to 84, Jefferson to 83, Adams to 90. They survived not because their medical care was good. They survived because they were wealthy enough to eat well, lived in relatively uncrowded conditions that limited infectious disease exposure, and had constitutions robust enough to survive both their illnesses and their physicians. The remedies on this list were available to all colonial Americans. The skill to use them appropriately was not. Number 13. Hartshorn, spirit of ammonia, for fainting and respiratory depression. Hartshorn, originally made by distilling the horns of deer and later produced by chemical synthesis, was the volatile ammonia preparation that colonial physicians held under the noses of patients who had fainted, who had taken overdoses of sedating preparations, or who were in respiratory depression from fever or blood loss. The sharp, volatile ammonia stimulated the respiratory reflex through direct irritation of the nasal mucosa, and it was fast enough in its action to be genuinely life-saving in cases of respiratory depression. Smelling salts, which work through exactly the same mechanism using ammonium carbonate, remained standard first aid equipment in every physician's bag through the 20th century, and they are still used in athletic settings today. The colonial hartshorn bottle was the direct ancestor of the smelling salts that coaches have carried on the sidelines for centuries. Number 12. Wild senna for constipation. Senna, in the colonial period specifically, Cassia marilandica, the American wild senna, was the reliable cathartic of colonial households that could not afford or obtain the imported Alexandrian senna from the Egyptian apothecary trade. The leaves contain anthraquinone glycosides, sannicides, that stimulate intestinal motility through direct action on the colonic nervous system. Senna is still the active ingredient in prescription-strength laxatives used for bowel preparation before colonoscopy, and is a standard treatment for opioid-induced constipation. The colonial housewife who brewed wild senna tea for a constipated family member was using the same active compound that modern gastroenterologists prescribe before procedures. The compound, the mechanism, and the clinical effect have not changed. Only the packaging and the price. Number 11. Rattlesnake master for venomous bites. Eryngium uxifolium, known as rattlesnake master, was among the most specifically named plants in colonial American medicine. The spiky, yucca-like plant of the eastern and Central American prairies was the primary treatment for rattlesnake bite in regions where rattlesnakes were common and physicians were not. The root was chewed and applied as a poultice to the bite site, and a tea of the root was given internally. Cherokee, Choctaw, and other southeastern peoples had used it for this purpose for generations. Colonial settlers adopted it through direct contact because the alternative, waiting for a physician who might be a day's ride away while rattlesnake venom did its work, was not acceptable. Modern pharmacological analysis has found saponins in Eryngium with anti-inflammatory properties consistent with reducing the inflammatory component of snakebite injury. It was not an antivenom. It was anti-inflammatory support for a patient whose immune system was managing a venom it had encountered before. Number 10. American pennyroyal for insects and fever. Hedioma pulegioides, American pennyroyal, was the insect repellent of colonial America, rubbed directly on skin and clothing to deter the mosquitoes that carried malaria in the colonial South. It was also used internally for fever and to promote menstruation. Polygon, the primary volatile compound, is a confirmed insect repellent, and the mechanism is the same as DEET, but through different chemistry. A 2011 study confirmed pennyroyal's significant repellent activity against mosquito species. The colonial use of pennyroyal to repel the insects that carried malaria was an empirically rational mosquito control strategy that predated the understanding of malaria transmission by 2 centuries. The colonists did not know malaria came from mosquitoes. They knew pennyroyal kept mosquitoes away. The outcome was the same. Number 9. Cardinal flower for syphilis and respiratory illness. Lobelia cardinalis, the brilliant red cardinal flower, was used by colonial physicians for 2 applications that seem unrelated but share an underlying pharmacological connection. For syphilis, the epidemic sexually transmitted infection that devastated colonial populations, cardinal flower root was one of several botanicals used as a substitute for the mercury treatments that caused as much damage as they prevented. For respiratory illness with spasm, the lobeline in the plant produced bronchodilation. Lobeline, the primary alkaloid, is found in higher concentration in the blue lobelia that appeared in the Civil War episode of this series, and it acts on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the lungs. Colonial physicians who used cardinal flower for respiratory spasm were delivering a genuine bronchodilator. Those who used it for syphilis were working at the limits of what botany could do against a bacterial infection that would not yield to plant medicine. The antibacterial that cured syphilis was not discovered until 1928. Number 8. Dittany of the Americas for wound healing. 3 different plants carried the name dittany in colonial American medicine: Cunilla oreganoides, Dictamnus albus, imported from Europe, and various Origanum relatives. The American dittany, stone mint or Maryland dittany, was used consistently for wound healing, for the fevers of infectious illness, and as a diaphoretic to promote sweating. The volatile oils in dittany species contain thymol, carvacrol, and related antimicrobial compounds, the same chemistry found in oil of oregano, thyme, and hyssop. The colonial physician who dressed a wound with a dittany preparation was applying genuine antimicrobial chemistry to the wound surface. The confusion of 3 plants under one name is itself a lesson in colonial medicine. The apothecary, who could correctly identify which dittany was which, had knowledge of direct clinical value. Number 7. Hepatica, liver leaf, for liver and chronic illness. Hepatica nobilis, the small woodland plant with purple or white flowers that bloomed in the earliest spring before the leaf litter had even dried, was named by the doctrine of signatures. Its 3-lobed leaves resembled a liver, so people used it to treat liver complaints. The doctrine of signatures was magical thinking. Hepatica did not stop working because the theory behind its prescription was wrong. The plant contains moderate anti-inflammatory compounds, and it has traditional applications across multiple European and American cultural contexts for liver and digestive complaints. More importantly, the doctrine of signatures, whatever its scientific inadequacy, motivated colonial physicians and apothecaries to observe plant morphology carefully and to match plants to conditions with a consistency that sometimes stumbled onto pharmacologically appropriate connections. Hepatica worked moderately for liver complaints, not because it looked like a liver, but because it contained compounds with real liver-supportive activity. Number 6. Prickly ash berries for rheumatism and circulation. Xanthoxylum americanum, northern prickly ash, appeared in the Civil War episode of this series as a bark medicine for tooth pain and circulation. Here the berries take a different form in colonial medicine. Dried and powdered and mixed with alcohol, they were the treatment for chronic rheumatism and the cold extremities that came with circulation insufficient to warm the hands and feet through eastern winters. The berries have a higher concentration of the same circulatory stimulating alkaloids as the bark, xanthoxylin, and related compounds, with confirmed peripheral vasodilatory effects. Colonial physicians who prescribed prickly ashberry preparations for rheumatism and circulation complaints were using a plant with the correct pharmacological profile for those conditions. The connection between inflammation, poor circulation, and joint pain that colonial physicians made empirically is one that modern integrative medicine is re-examining with fresh research interest. Number 5. Fever bark, Pinckneyia, the American cinchona. Pinckneyia bracteata fever bark is the only plant named directly for one of the founding fathers, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the Revolutionary War general and twice presidential candidate from South Carolina. It was named for him because he promoted the use of its bark as a local American substitute for Peruvian cinchona bark, the quinine source, in the treatment of malaria in the South Carolina Lowcountry, where malaria was endemic. The bark of Pinckneyia contains iridoid glycosides with antipyretic and anti-inflammatory properties. It is not a source of quinine and does not work through the same mechanism as cinchona bark, but it reduced fever reliably enough that colonial physicians used it consistently when Peruvian bark was unavailable. A plant named for a founding father used to treat the disease that was the greatest infectious threat to the southern colonies. With pharmacological properties that modern research has confirmed, this is colonial medicine at its most interesting intersection of history and science. Number 4. Tansy for intestinal parasites and insects. Tanacetum vulgare, tansy, was the dual-purpose colonial herb for intestinal worms and insect repulsion. Grown in every colonial kitchen garden, the strongly aromatic plant was laid in bundles across windowsills and doorways to repel flies, moths, and other insects. Taken internally in small, careful doses, it was the standard treatment for intestinal worms, roundworm, pinworm, and tapeworm in children and adults. Thujone, the primary volatile compound, is toxic to intestinal parasites at concentrations that are safe for humans in the small doses of traditional use. The insect repellent effect is confirmed. Thujone disrupts insect nervous systems in ways that make it an effective deterrent. At high doses, Thujone is toxic to humans, so the colonial practitioners who administered tansy carefully in small amounts for a limited duration were working within the therapeutic window. The colonial kitchen garden plant was simultaneously a pest deterrent and an antiparasitic pharmaceutical. Number 3. The first American pharmacopoeia and what it contained. In 1820, the United States Pharmacopoeia was published for the first time. It was the official list of medications recognized as legitimate by American medicine. It contained 217 items. Of those, 165 were derived from plants. The botanical medicines of colonial practice were not discarded when American medicine professionalized. They were codified, listed by name, with standardized preparations and doses: cinchona bark, wild senna, Solomon's seal, Virginia snakeroot, Chalop, gentian. The Founding Fathers' medical era produced a pharmacopoeia that was predominantly botanical, because botanical medicine was what American physicians had learned to use, what they had observed across generations of colonial practice, and what was available in the American landscape. The pharmaceutical revolution of the 20th century replaced most of those botanical listings with synthetic compounds. It did not always replace what worked. It replaced what was patentable. Number 2, inoculation, the colonial medical revolution. In 1721, Boston was in the grip of a smallpox epidemic that would kill hundreds of people. A minister named Cotton Mather, better known for his role in the Salem witch trials, had read accounts from Africa and the Ottoman Empire of a practice called variolation, deliberately infecting a person with material from a smallpox pustule to induce a mild form of the disease and subsequent immunity. He learned the practice from Onesimus, an enslaved African man who had undergone the procedure in Africa. A physician named Zabdiel Boylston began variolating Boston residents in 1721 against enormous opposition from the medical establishment. Of the 287 people he variolated, 6 died, a mortality rate of 2%. Among the 5,759 Bostonians who contracted smallpox naturally during the epidemic, 844 died, a mortality rate of 14%. Variolation was the direct predecessor of vaccination. The procedure that became the most consequential medical intervention in human history was introduced to American medicine through the knowledge of an enslaved African man that a Massachusetts minister had the intellectual openness to take seriously. Number 1, the foxglove leaf that became cardiology. In 1785, an English physician named William Withering published an account of the foxglove and some of its medical uses, the most important pharmacological publication of the 18th century. Digitalis purpurea, foxglove, had been used in European folk medicine for generations for the swollen legs and labored breathing of heart failure. Withering systematized its use, identified appropriate doses, documented outcomes across hundreds of patients, and established the evidence base for a treatment that became the foundation of modern cardiology. Digitalis preparations, digoxin and digitoxin, remained among the most prescribed cardiac medications through the late 20th century and are still used today for certain cardiac arrhythmias and heart failure. Foxglove was grown in colonial American gardens. Colonial physicians who knew Withering's work used it for the same cardiac indications he described. The heart medicine of the Founding Fathers era, derived from a garden flower, documented by a rigorous clinical observer, is still on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines today. 25 remedies. From the era of powdered wigs, bleeding bowls, and bezoar stones. Some of them did not work at all. Some of them killed patients. And some of them, the Peruvian bark, the inoculation, the foxglove, the bitters, the wound herbs learned from indigenous peoples who had spent millennia in this landscape, were as pharmacologically correct as anything in a modern physician's arsenal. The difference between the medicine that worked and the medicine that did not was not magic. It was observation. The colonial practitioners who tracked outcomes, who learned from indigenous healers, who distinguished between the plants that produced results and the ones that did not. Those physicians and their patients built the foundation that American medicine eventually stood on. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. Because understanding where medicine came from is how you understand what it still owes.